Welcome back. We are still in week 2, philosophy of mind. We've covered dualism, Descartes' arguments for dualism. We've covered Churchland's arguments against dualism, and for physicalism, materialism, minds are brains, right? Um, Now we are on to Hilary Putnam. Hilary Putnam is going to point out some problems, both for the arguments for dualism and for uh, the identity, mind-brain identity claim. And he's going to offer a different account, which he calls functionalism, which is meant to capture sort of the best of both worlds, right? If you're at all convinced by the possibility, right, of minds that aren't brains, right? Again, it doesn't have to be a disembodied soul, right? Even if artificial intelligence is possible and a computer could be a mind, that seems to refute the claim that minds just are brains, right? There would be non-brain minds out there. So functionalism is meant to be largely compatible with physicalism, right? You don't have to believe in souls to believe functionalism, and yet it's going to try to um, make it so that, aliens, octopuses, artificial intelligences could also count as minds, just differently instantiated. Still physical, but different kinds of physical stuff. So let's get into this article. So first, if you read this article first and you were a little confused, it does sort of it's maybe one of the more sort of advanced. Now we're jumping into, like, this is written in the 60s, contemporary analytic philosophy. So it assumes a little bit of terminology. So I'm going to try to explain some of that, and then hopefully that will make sense of some of the stuff if on first read it didn't quite make sense. So we're going to talk. Putnam talks about properties. So what is a property? Properties are just things an object in the world can have. Uh, so redness is a property, right? Things can be red, apples can be red, books can be red. It's a property those things can have. Weighing 50 pounds is a property something can have. Being 6 foot tall is a property. Being a policeman, right? Pretty much anything that you can say about an object, that's going to be a property. Right? So, and properties are things that exist in the world. So just as uh, apples exist, redness exists in the world, according to this view. If you want to argue, philosophers will argue about anything, right? Sort of the basic Putnam's assuming here. Now, sometimes you may see this terminology. So in logic world, the types of words we use to talk about objects, we call singular terms, right? And words we use to talk about properties, they call predicates, right? So, kind of slightly fancy words, but all it means is Nate, right? So when I put something in single quotes, I'm talking about a word. So the word Nate is a singular term, and the object it refers to is me, right? Uh, Weighs 170 pounds, right? That's a phrase, right? So it's, again, a linguistic object. It's a phrase, so it's a predicate, and it refers to the property of weighing 170 pounds. So things in the world weigh 170 pounds, they have that property. And if you want to talk about those things, you use a word, and we call that kind of word a predicate, right? If you want to say something about the world, again, about language here, if I want to use language to talk about the world, I need a singular term word, and I need a predicate, sort of usually phrase. So I'll say something like Nate weighs 170 pounds, right? So that's a sentence that I can say, and that kind of sentence picks out a particular state of affairs in the world. A particular object, me, having the property of weighing 170 pounds. We will also talk about concepts, right? Putnam talks about concepts. Um, so sometimes, I think more often in contemporary sort of psychology and philosophy of mind, we talk about concepts as mental things, right? In my head, I have a concept of redness, right? Or a concept of what a chair is. Uh, Other times, philosophers more will talk about them as like something in the world, right? Like sets of objects. So the concept chair is just like the set of all chairs or something like that. Uh, that's not so important, right? Which is right, the right way to approach it. Uh, But concepts seem to underlie our ability to talk about things, right? If I can talk about chairs and you know what I mean when I talk about chairs, it seems like we both have a chair concept in our minds, right? We're able to pick out the same things and understand what we mean when we talk to each other. It doesn't matter sort of whether Putnam thinks concepts are mental things or sets of objects or whatever. He defines them as what he calls synonymy classes, right? So all he means by that is that synonymous terms like water, Wasser, the German term, H2O, right? These are all synonymous. They, so they all express the same concept. And for him, I think what he's saying is for him, the concept of water is just the class of all things that these words pick out. Like the concept of the number two is just the class of all pairs. So this is a little more complicated than you really need, but just if you at any point got confused by what Putnam was saying, this is what he means, right? So yeah, I think it's easiest to think of concepts as like mental mental states that allow you to classify things and allow right you to understand what someone else means by a word, right? When I say water, if you speak English, you know what I mean, right? Because we have the same concept. Okay, well, the reason we're talking about concepts is because it comes up in his critique of some of the objections to physicalism. So basically, sort of the sorts of arguments that Descartes was making, right? Um, Putnam thinks that all those arguments sort of commit a similar sort of fallacy, right? And what they're doing is they're sort of collapsing the distinction between linguistic objects, words, right, and metaphysical objects, things in the world, right? So, for example, Descartes says, when he says that um, if I can imagine two things being apart, then they can't be identical. Putnam says what Descartes' really doing here is he's saying that in order for two properties in the world, things in the world to be identical, then the two concepts I have in my head that pick those two things out would have to be synonymous, right? Because when I'm trying to conceive of those two things as being distinct, I'm using my concepts, right? And so Descartes saying, whatever I can do with my concepts, the world's going to like follow along, right? Um, and you can see that if anything struck you as weird about about Descartes' argument, that's probably sort of what was wrong with it, right? Descartes sort of like saying, see what you can imagine. If you can imagine it, it's possible, right? And you might think, well, what does my imagination have to do with the world? And Putnam's sort of pointing out that problem. Your imagination is based on your concepts, and your concepts don't have to line up with the world. So of course, we can imagine a mind experiencing pain that doesn't have a brain, doesn't have a particular kind of nerve fiber firing, right? So here are some of the nerve fibers involved in pain. So there's C fibers, A delta fibers, A alpha, A beta. Those are just different kinds of nerve fibers. We've also got different kinds of pain receptors, right? Um, so, at some point you were a kid and you experienced pain and you knew a fair amount about pain, but you didn't know anything about any of those receptors. Um, but what you know doesn't necessarily mean that right that the world is limited by what you know, right? So sure, the concept of pain isn't in any way synonymous with a nerve fiber firing, right? But that doesn't mean that the property of pain is not identical to the property of a nerve firing, right? Things in the world might actually be identical. You just happen to have two different concepts, right? Just like in physics, right? Temperature and mean molecular kinetic energy are not synonymous terms. Again, when you were a child, you had an idea of what hot and cold meant. You had no idea what mean molecular kinetic energy was. Um, but nonetheless, right, despite your sort of lack of knowledge, those two are identical, right? Temperature just is molecules moving, right? Hot is just molecules moving really fast. Um, so Descartes' whole method, right, of concentrating on being able to clearly and distinctly conceive of two things being separate, right? And if you can do that, then he says they can't be identical. That doesn't tell you anything about the world. It just tells you that you're operating with two different concepts. All right, so Putnam wants to offer a different account of mind, right? Different than dualism, but also different than the identity theory, we'll call the kind of physicalism that Linda's talking about, where identity theory is just brains are identical, minds are identical to brains, right? Putnam's not going to go for that either. He's going to offer something new, and he wants to frame it as an empirical hypothesis. So he's saying, I think this is an idea that can sort of best make sense of the data. Um, it might turn out to be false, like any empirical hypothesis, but until it's falsified, right? If it explains everything better than dualism or physicalism, then it's a good contender, right? Um, and then it'll be the scientist's job largely. Putnam is not in a lab doing experiments, right, or even necessarily designing studies that could falsify this hypothesis. Um, you know, Sometimes that's how the labor gets carved up, right? Philosophers of mind sort of come up with these ideas, and then psychologists, cognitive scientists go out and test them. Uh, but anyways, he's gonna set out the hypothesis, right, and then someone else's job to decide if it's true. Uh, so the hypothesis is that mental states, and he's going to use pain as his example of a mental state here for the entire article. Uh, Mental states are not identical to brain states. Instead, there's something else. There's something a bit more abstract. He's going to call it a functional state of the entire organism, right? Um, so this view of the mind has become known as functionalism, and there's a few different versions of functionalism, and Putnam's version has become known as machine functionalism because, as we'll see, he models the mind on a Turing machine, which is a very sort of abstract kind of computer. And here above me, you can see that functionalism is alive and well, at least into like I think the 90s when this article was put out. So this is a functional model of a child's ability for what they call pretense, right? The ability to imagine and pretend a banana is a phone and stuff like that. So these are sort of the functional diagram of, right, you have some perceptual process is just a box and it leads into a box where your beliefs are, right? And then those beliefs, along with your desires, go into a decision-making system, right? So notice that each of these boxes is sort of defined by its job, right? One does perception, one does decision-making, and you can sort of map out the mind this way. And maybe some of these boxes correspond to areas of the brain, or maybe not, right? It's not really super concerned with uh, what kind of physical system is instantiating it. It's concerned with the jobs that each thing does. Basically, functionalism is concerned with, they say, look, a mental state is defined by the job it does, right? So, machine functionalism, based on the idea of a Turing machine. Um, if you've seen The Imitation Game, right, you know a little bit about Alan Turing. He was a mathematician, instrumental in sort of winning World War II for the Allies, right, and helping to build computers basically that deciphered the German codes, right? Um, uh, Kind of a sad story if you've seen it, right? So he was gay at a time when you basically weren't allowed to be gay. It was sort of criminal, and it sort of wreaked havoc on his life, and yeah, he ended up dying sort of early, and so, but very interesting guy, very clever guy, and he invented the concept of this thing called the Turing machine, right? Which is basically the most abstract kind of computer, right? Before anyone had built one, right? He had the concept of it worked out. And Putnam's using this partly because, I mean, the Turing machine, I think he developed in the 40s, 50s, right? And this is much later, and people were building computers already. But I think in part Putnam's using the Turing machine because it's the most general, most abstract kind of computer, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be the sort of thing that I have on my lap right now. It could be something completely different. It's just a much more general sort of computational device. Okay, so the Turing machine is going to be a model of the sort of organism that can have mental states. Um, Putnam talks about probabilistic, right? Turing machines, which he calls a probabilistic automaton. So, a Turing machine can be deterministic or probabilistic. So deterministic just means, you know, given certain inputs, you're guaranteed certain outputs, right? Probabilistic means that given a certain input, well, with some maybe 60% chance of output A and 40% chance of output B, or something like that. Or given a given input, 10% of chance of 10 different outputs, something like that. Right? That's just the difference, whether it's like guaranteed predictability or some sort of probabilistic outcome. And so suppose that your Turing machine, again, we'll get into a little more detail of what a Turing machine is, but it's just a sort of computer, right? It runs an algorithm. But you can imagine that it also has sensory outputs, a camera, or sorry, sensory inputs, camera, whatever other sorts of sensors you might want, auditory, ears, right, touch, whatever, and motor outputs. It can do things, right? Maybe it's a robot with arms and legs, right? Maybe it's more like a crab, right? Maybe it just has a single sort of very simple output, right? Moves forward and back, whatever. But it just has sensory inputs, motor outputs. Now, the program for the Turing machine is called the machine table. And what the machine table does is it just, for every possible combination of an internal state of the machine, which will explain more about what the internal state is, but these Turing machines have different internal states that they might be in at any given time. And if you're in internal state A and you have a certain input, right, it'll tell you what the output will, what the next state might be, what the outputs will be. If you're in a different state, you might have the same input but have a different output, right? So it's basically sort of three variables going on, right? You have inputs, what state is the machine in, and the combination of the input and the state of the machine tells you either the next state or the motor output, right? I think it helps to just build a simple Turing machine, right? So we can do this right now. So here's the machine table for a Turing machine. So the Turing machine just has like a tape with symbols on it and a read-write head, right? So down at the bottom there, you'll see the tape and the symbols that we have written on the tape. And then that little arrow is, like you can imagine, is the read-write erase head, and that can move right to the right or to the left. And given whatever position it's in, given the machine table, it'll dictate what it does next. So here's our machine table. Number one, if the read-write head is in machine state A and it encounters a 1, it moves 1 square to the right and stays in A. Number two, if the head is in state A and encounters a plus, it replaces it with a 1, stays in state A, moves 1 square to the right. Number three, if the head is in state A and encounters a plus, move 1 square to the left, go into machine state B. And 4, if the head is in state B and encounters a 1, delete it, replace it with a pound, and halt, right? So let's say that, here's our tape. Our head is on the first 1 there right now, and let's say it's in machine state A. Okay, so what does it do? Well, we go to our machine table, and it looks like number 1, right, is the most relevant here. It's the machine state A, and it's just encountered a 1. So what does it say it does? It says just move 1 square to the right and stay in state A. So if we move 1 square to the right, we'll encounter another 1, right? So, first of all, what is this machine doing? It's an addition machine, right? Maybe that's obvious. If you look at the tape, it looks like 3 plus 2, right? They're kind of a funny notation for writing the numbers 3 and 2, but clear enough, right? Just as good as the numeral. It's fine, right? So we're adding 3 plus 2, right? So the machine starts on the 1, and the machine table says, if you encounter a 1, just move over. Okay, it does that. It's on another 1, says if you encounter 1, move over. So it does that one more time. One more time, now it hits a plus, right? Okay, so what happens if we hit a plus? That looks like number 2 here. If you hit a plus, replace it with a 1, and then stay in state A and move 1 square to the right, right? So now you have to imagine that we've got 4 1s in a row, right? The plus is gone. And then when we move back to the right, we've encountered a 1, so we're back to rule 1, right? Which says, okay, just move to the right. So we move right one more time. We're in 1, move right one more time. Okay, now we've hit a pound sign, right? So what does the machine table do in that case? Well, number 3 here is relevant. We're still in state A, right? Every time we've moved, it said to stay in state A. So here we've hit a pound sign, and it says, okay, if you hit a pound, move 1 square left, and then go into machine state B. Okay, this is our first time in B. So now our head is at the very last one there, and remember our plus is also turned into a 1. And now it's in B. Okay, well, what happens if you're in machine state B and you encounter a 1? Well, now number 4 is relevant. Turns out in that case, you delete that 1, replace it with a pound, and stop. Okay, if we've done that, you'll find, and if you want to sort of do it on a piece of paper, you're welcome to. But what we'll have then is our first 3 ones will remain. Our plus will have become a 1, so we'll have 4 ones. That 5th one will remain, and the last one will have become a pound. So we will just have 5 ones standing out there, right? So given this weird notation, we've changed 3 plus 2 into 5, right? So a little very simple Turing machine for addition, right? Maybe sort of ridiculously simple, but like obviously you can think of much more complex ones, but now here's an actual Turing machine, you work through it, and it's a fun engineering problem to like build this Turing machine, right? You could certainly program a computer to do it, right? But you can maybe build it out of Legos, right? Or strings and tape and cans or hydraulics or whatever, right? It's simple enough that there's lots of different ways that you could build it. So before I get to the Coke machine example, the analogy to the mind starts to become clear when you think about, you can sort of step back and think more abstractly about sort of what those different states were, right? So when it's in state A, it's just cruising right past 1s, right? And it's just looking for pluses and changing those to 1s, right? So you can kind of think of state A as a 1 ignorer and a plus seeker, right? And a plus changer to oneer or something like that, right? You can think of it as a little job, right? And state B as sort of a 1 destroyer or something like that, right? Um, Here's an even more sort of like maybe another way to analogize and sort of get the rough analogy between a Turing machine and a mind. So here's another very sort of like simple. It would, I think, count as a Turing machine, right? Because it has inputs, different states, and different outputs depending on the input and the state, right? So here's an old-fashioned Coke machine that takes coins, right? And let's say that Cokes are 15 cents, right? So let's say the machine is in state A, and if it's in state A and you put in a dime, you get no output, right? But the machine goes into state B, right? You've only put in 10 cents, right? Cokes are 15 cents. But if the machine is in state B and you put in a nickel, you do get an output. You get a Coke, right? And if it's in state B and the input is a dime, you get a Coke and a nickel back, right? You put in 20 and you get 5 cents back. So state B is sort of like a desire for a nickel, right? If you just give it a nickel, it'll give you the Coke and it's happy, right? If you give it a dime, it's going to spit a nickel back out. It only wanted 5 cents, right? Again, very rough analogy, right? But this is the beginning of, right, the idea. Obviously, anything that's going to be much more analogous to a human mind is going to be a much more complicated Turing machine, right? But you get the idea of a mental state as an internal state of a machine, right? So, um, right, this is the idea of machine functionalism. The mind is a Turing machine. Okay, great. Now we have to sort of he has to make a few sort of like a little more technical things to make um, this hypothesis actually work, right? He's to establish some terminology and then set forward a few conditions to rule out some uh, bad ways that this could be interpreted, right? So, first of all, any actual physical system in the world um, is going to actually instantiate any number of different machine tables. What we mean by this is, given like the Coke machine, right, or the addition, you could write a machine table that would give you all the exact. You could write different machine tables that would all give you the exact same behaviors, right? Um, anyone who's done any programming knows this. There's different ways to make the computer do the same thing, right? You could have the list of 4 rules. You could have a list of 100 rules to get it to do the exact same thing. So that's just a fact about the nature of the sort of these abstract Turing machines. Sort of actually an infinite number of Turing machines that would produce the exact same behavior of any system. So how do we know which particular Turing machine something is instantiating? Well, we'll just stipulate that if you have what we'll call a description of the system, that's going to specify which particular machine table, right, you're using. Right? We're just going to choose a machine table to describe the system. That will be our description of the system. And so that machine table, we'll call that the functional organization of the system, right? How it's organized to accomplish the function, right, that it's trying to accomplish. So at any given moment, we can describe the total state of the system relative to this description using the machine table. We can describe, right, is it in state A or state B, right? And what are the relative inputs and motor outputs at that moment, given the history, right, and the whole machine table. So knowing the total state of a system, right, you know a lot about its behavior, what it's going to do at any moment given any sort of input, right? Sometimes that now, if it's a probabilistic automaton, you know that you have that knowledge, at least about the probabilities. You can't necessarily predict 100%, right, what the output is. If it's deterministic, you do know 100%. But knowing this total state of the system tells you nothing about the physical realization of the Turing machine. It doesn't tell you if it's built out of tin cans or brain or Legos or, right, electronics. It just tells you about, again, the functional inputs and outputs and changes of state. So here is where Putnam sets forth sort of more formally his hypothesis, right? So he says being in a mental state, for example, pain, right? So we'll call it pain here, is a functional state of the organism. And here are some conditions on that. Number one, all organisms capable of feeling pain are probabilistic automata, right? So anything that can feel pain is a kind of Turing machine, and in particular, it's a probabilistic version. Number two, now that's important, right? Because right, it should be clear that like sometimes, right, if you poke me really hard right in the cheek, in a certain mood, I'll say, "Ow, stop it." In another mood, if I'm really trying to be stoic, I might do nothing, right? So my outputs given a certain input are going to be probabilistic. They're going to depend on a lot of other things, right? And in particular, what particular state I'm in. So if I'm in state A, which is make sure no one sees you cry out, right? Then I'll say nothing, right? That's state A for me, and so on, right? Okay. Okay. So that's the first claim. Basically, just is machine functionalism. If you can feel pain or whatever mental state, right? It's not just pain. You are the kind of Turing machine. Number two, every organism capable of feeling pain possesses at least one description of a certain kind. Remember, we described what a description was, right? That's just picking out the machine table that describes the system. So, in other words, being capable of feeling pain just is to possess an appropriate kind of functional organization, right? That can be described by the machine table, right? A certain kinds of behavior, internal and external, given certain inputs and outputs and transitions and stuff like that. Those are the main. So 1 and 2 are really the meat of it, right? It's saying every mental state is a functional state of an organism, right? It's again, a state of a Turing machine. 3 and 4 are just to sort of rule out some stuff. So number 3 says no organism capable of feeling pain possesses a decomposition into parts which separately possess descriptions of the kind referred to in 2 and 2. So what Putnam says explicitly is he wants to rule out something like a swarm of bees being able to feel being an individual pain feeler, right? He thinks it's got to be a whole state of a single organism. I mean, I think also 3 would lead you to a weird infinite regress. So if the organism, right, if the organism also had parts that were the same Turing machine as the organism, then those parts would also have to have parts that were the same Turing machine, and it seems like it would go on forever. So you don't want that. You just want one whole organism with one, can be described by one machine table, right? And then number 4, for every description of the kind referred to in 2, there exists a subset of the sensory inputs such that an organism with that description is in pain when and only when some of its sensory inputs are in that subset. That means you have to have pain sensors, right, to be in pain. Okay, some clarification. Some of this I just said, really. Here are some of our various types of pain sensors, right? Some of your pain sensors are for like detect stabbing pain, some temperature, like burning and stuff. Some of them are chemical for like chemical burns and things like that. Um, some of them are stretch, right? They detect stretching. Uh, okay, so what is, when he says the appropriate kind of functional organism, what is that? Uh, well, for example, for a pain sensing organism, it should be a functional organism that allows you to learn from sensory experience, right? The point of pain is for you to learn not to do that thing again, learn not to touch hot stoves, right? And know that that thing is harmful to you. Again, when he talks about the subset of sensory inputs, as I said, these are the pain sensors. These are the things that signal bodily damage, right? The thing you need to learn about. Um, it's going to be hooked up to those inputs, right? Um, and those inputs are going to have certain values that are going to, again, cause the machine to learn to avoid that in the future. And again, I talked about three. He wants to rule out sort of distributed forms or something like that. So a bit abstract, right? Hopefully you were able to keep up with that a bit after I explained it. I expect that some of you probably got lost somewhere in the original article, right? It's fine. Um, and again, I'm not going to quiz you at a heavy level of detail, right? If you want to write a paper, maybe you want to get into some of these weeds, right? If you find this particularly interesting. But if you're like kind of getting lost on this part, don't worry too much. And the abstraction is part of the point. That's sort of the beauty of it, right? You need an abstract account of the mind if you want to make it the case that the physical stuff doesn't matter, right? If pain can be felt by robots, aliens, octopuses, and brains, um, what pain is has to be a pretty fairly abstract kind of thing. Right? So this is the big advantage over identity theory, over just saying minds or brains, right? It can account for all sorts of different physical things, right? Being able to be in the same mental state. Uh, it's even actually compatible with uh, souls, right? As long as they have the functional organism, whatever's the functional organization, right? As we complained in the last lecture, dualists haven't really given us even a functional account of the soul, right? Uh, But if you did, if it had that functional organization, then sure, a soul can be in pain too. Um, but really, the advantage is, again, for most of us, our intuition is like, yeah, the mind has to be a physical thing, right? But also, we want it to be flexible enough that it can like be different kinds of physical things, and functionalism seems to hit the sweet spot right there. Uh, Again, because mind-brain identity theory requires any organism in pain has to have a very particular kind of brain with a very particular kind of physical chemical structure, and that brain has to be in a very particular physical chemical kind of state, and nothing else can be in pain, right? No octopuses, aliens, robot pain. Um, Now that might turn out to be true, right? But sometimes there's sort of like parallel evolution does sometimes converge on a sort of single solution, right? Like eyes have evolved sort of separately, like in many ways, right? It seems like an eye is the best solution to collecting, uh, right, light information. Um, but it's a little ambitious to say that, right, that every organism that needs to avoid tissue damage will converge on C fiber firing or something like that, right? Um, And even if that is the case with pain, that has, if you're an identity theorist, right, if you think the mind just the brain, then that has to be the case for every single mental state, right? So it has to be the case that evolution converged on the if any organism wants to have the belief that cats are cute, they have to have this very specific kind of sort of brain state, right? Uh, if any organism anywhere in the universe wants to have is going to have the desire to eat a funyun, it's going to have to be a very specific kind of particular kind of brain state. That seems a little wild, right? It seems like we could program a computer, right, to believe that cats are cute or right, want a funyun maybe. So here is where my little mini lecture on behaviorism last time hopefully pays off, right? So that this part is not totally baffling to you, right? Um, so remember behaviorism, right, was the claim that, well, let's talk about logical behaviorism. Remember there were three kinds. Logical behaviorism says any sentence, right, using the word pain or whatever mental state can be translated into sentences using behavior. That's all it means. They're synonymous, right? Mental state words just are descriptions of behavior, right? So the word pain, the concept pain, just means wincing and groaning and avoiding certain kinds of stimuli and so on, right? Putnam says that's a wrong approach, right? What they're doing is confusing the property of pain, right, whatever it happens to be, with our particular method of verifying whether someone's in pain, right? So it just so happens that as humans, pretty much the only way we know whether is in pain is by looking at their behavior, right? So that's kind of how our concept of pain uh, is crafted, right? But that doesn't mean that we have any direct access to the actual property of pain, right? If we don't, then our concept is going to be slightly different than what it actually is, right? Um, and if, as Putnam thinks, pain is some sort of abstract functional state, right, that includes internal states of the organism, yeah, well, we don't have access to that. So of course our concept of pain is not going to include those like internal states. And again, right, our concepts are not like the foolproof guide to what actually exists in the world. As we saw, we know heat under one concept that, you learn it from when you're a child. Heat kind of hurts when you touch it. Heat is the thing that boils water and cooks food and so on and makes the sidewalk hard, painful to walk on and so on. And later in school, maybe you learn about molecules and molecular energy. Um, but those are different concepts. They happen to be the same property, right? Different concepts. That's just an artifact of how humans learn about the world. This tells us nothing about what the properties actually are and whether they're identical or distinct. I mean, and another big problem with behaviorism that you'll see is just kind of famously inadequate if you really try to get into it, right? So, like as I said before, right? One day maybe you poke me in the face real hard, and I go, "Ow, stop it!" And another day, if I'm in a particular mood to be very stoic, you poke me in the face and I do nothing, right? Um, the behavior is not like guaranteed given a certain stimulus, right? Um, so what the behaviorists have to do is define pain with sort of a disposition to cry out given certain circumstances, right? So they can make sense of like why sometimes I'll cry out and sometimes I won't, right? Um, so like, but then the problem is each of those sort of dispositions. So say, oh, I'll be disposed to cry out in pain so long as I'm not in a stoic mood or something like that. Okay. But then you have to add another clause because there's all kinds of other reasons I might not cry out in pain, right? Maybe I think a murderer is nearby, right? Um, in which case I'm not going to cry out in pain and reveal my location to them or something, right? Um, and so on, right? There's so many reasons that I might cry out or not cry out, and it just becomes impossible and ultimately circular to try to capture all those, again, dispositions in behavioral terms. Um, so functionalism, you don't have to do that because you can just talk about directly the internal states of the organism, right? Again, the Turing machine, just the simple addition one. It's got state A, state B. Pain can be one of those internal states, not a behavioral state. Those exist for the functionalist. You don't have to explain them away and define them away and end up in this endless circle, right, of redefining stuff. Okay, so summing up functionalism, then I'm going to, with one more slide after this, offer there are functionalism is still alive and well, right? Um, but there's a lot of problems with it, right? We don't have a sort of an agreed on theory of the mind because all of them have problems. So there are problems with functionalism. I'll point out just one in the next slide. But so far, right, the reason we're talking about it and why it's so attractive still is functionalism does seem to offer the best of all worlds, right? It's not tied to dualism. You don't have to believe in souls, but it is compatible with it if you want to believe in souls. but you can also be a kind of physicalist if you're a functionalist. Now, you're not going to be an identity physicalist. You're not going to believe that all minds are brains, but what you can say is that all minds are physical things of one sort or another, right? They might be brains, or they might be computers, or they might be whatever alien minds are, right? Um, they'll always be physical. They don't have to be souls, right? But they don't always have to be the exact same kind of physical thing. So you may find that many of Churchland's arguments against dualism don't necessarily work against functionalism. And it's better than behaviorism, right? Because it's not tied to reducing mental states to behavior. You don't have to chase that constant defining away mental state terms, right? You say, no, there's states inside you, right? That's fine. And it's not, again, tied to any particular physical realization, right? Your brain could be a computer, whatever, in cans and string, right? So these are all, this, again, captures sort of the best of all the stuff and doesn't have the bad part. But it does have some problems. So here is one well-known problem for functionalism. Now I'm going to try to describe this, and I find often I get a lot of questions on this when I teach in a live lecture. Maybe this will come up on Wednesday. So one problem is spectrum inversion, right? So the idea is it's entirely possible, and in fact, this could actually currently be the case of some people, and we would never know it, right? Because their behavior will be functionally identical. So suppose I've got a particularly weird brain, and like colors are like reversed for me. So everything, right, that you see and call red, I call it red too, right? I was raised, people pointed at stuff and said, yeah, that's red. But when people said red, what I saw was the color on the right? So when I look at what to you is a red apple, I see the apple on the right there, right? Um, and my behavior is identical to you, right? I stop at red lights. They look different to me, but my whole life I've been trained to stop at those kind of lights, right? And I drive at what you see as green lights, right? Because again, everyone said, "Oh yeah, that color you drive, right?" And they called that color green, they called that color red. So yeah, I only eat the ripe tomatoes, right? Even though they look to me like, right, green grass would look like to you, and so on. So um, sometimes this, yeah, it takes a minute to get. So we can explain it more on Wednesday, right? But the idea is just like it's functionally reversed, but it turns out to be behaviorally like just totally undetectable, right? Because it's so perfectly reversed. Um, so if that sort of situation is conceivable, um, the inverted person and the normal person would be functionally identical, right? Those inputs do the exact same job, right? Um, the only difference is like what we call a phenomenal experience, right? The redness is not there for me, right? Instead, I'm experiencing a greenness, even though I call it red and I, treat it the same way you treat red things. I'm still having a different kind of experience, and that what we call the phenomenal aspect, this experiential conscious aspect, doesn't seem to be captured by functionalism. And you might think that's a pretty important thing you want to capture by your account of the mind. All right, that is it for the Philosophy of Mind week, and I will see you on Wednesday.